What's up everyone, my name is MarkHawk and today we're doing a quick side-by-side with the Sony HDR-AZ1 and we're putting it up against the new Sony HDR-AS200V. Now we're going to be looking at both of these cameras through a variety of topics as you can see on your screen here. Now you can use any of these links as quick links to jump to the section you're most interested in, otherwise sit back and we'll start playing them all in just a bit. So what we're going to do is we're going to start off by taking a look at what each of these cameras does best at 30 frames a second. Now with the Sony HDR-AZ1, that's going to be 1920 by 1080 at 30 frames a second. And we've also enabled XAVC-S Pro Mode. Pro Mode is the name given to the AS100 series, which you might be more familiar with. But what this does, it allows us to enable a higher bitrate, which basically gives us the best quality footage possible. Now with both of the cameras, that's going to be a 50 megabits a second bitrate, and the Sony HDR-AS200V is going to share the same max 30 frames per second settings at 1080p. Now right now we're looking at 30 frames a second. Take a look at these shrubs on the left side of the screen here running alongside of the rock. On the AZ1 you'll notice they're kind of soft and muddy compared to the AS200V, which has a lot more detail in all the bushes and a lot more sharpness. And you're probably also noticing the color profile on the AS200V is a little bit more saturated and poppy. We've actually made the jump here to 60 frames a second. Now the reason why I'm doing this is because there's a slight image degradation when you do this, and you can notice this a lot with the HDR-AZ1. Take a look at the artifacting that's happening on the left side of the screen and the sky. Now that isn't because of YouTube compression or me compressing out the video for you guys. That's actually something that's native in the camera. Now we'll go into the reasons why that's happening a little bit later, but basically you're going to notice this a lot in the AZ1, and it's going to jump in from time to time on the AS200, especially in these big bands where we have sort of a gradation of color, where we have a large amount of blue, but maybe the variation of the colors changes ever so slightly over a large scale. Again, looking at these at 60 frames a second, you can just see the colors on the AS200 definitely pop a little more. Now what we've done is we switched the cameras over to Steady Shot. What Steady Shot is going to do, and we'll go into it a little more later, is it's actually going to help us stabilize the footage. But the reason why we're looking at it here now is because of lens distortion, and to show you what the field of view differences are on sort of wide and Steady Shot field of views. When we enable Steady Shot, there is a possibility that there can be some issues. We're going to have some image degradation. You notice as we zoom in here, the AS200 doesn't look as sharp and crisp as it did before. The AZ1 is having a lot of those little compression issues in the skies. You can see they're all above the rocks. But again, we're trying to remove a lot of that distortion since we have no field of view options in either of these cameras. This is the only thing we can do to change the field of view when using video. If we're using photos, we have a field of view mode. We just can't seem to switch it with video. So what we're doing here is we're setting up these cameras with a difficult shot. We basically have our sun pointed directly into the lens. We have a good variation of dark elements and light elements, and we're trying to see how it exposes for all of those different types of variations. Now I'll say most of it's doing a pretty good job. I think the AS200 maybe is blowing out the sky a little much, but look, if you look here in the shadows and stuff like that, things look good. There's still a lot of detail, but some of those whites are kind of being crunched a little too hard, especially on the AZ1 on the left side. You can see just some of those rocks right up close. We're losing a lot of those cracked details that we're seeing in the AS200 on the right, but a lot of the stuff in the background and foreground still remains there, and it still has a lot of detail. We can see a lot of those cracks and stuff. Right, it's definitely deforming some of those artifact things we were talking about with the crunching values. For the AZ1, it shows up a lot more when we have the sun sort of in shot. With the AS200, it seems to be kind of the opposite, but it'll come and go throughout all of this video. Now as we sort of zoom in here, take a look at the main fixture of the rocks, kind of in the center of each of these screens. You can see a ton of detail in the HDR-200. It's just got a lot of clarity, a lot of sharpness, a lot of detail. The HDR-AZ1 actually retains a lot of that. It's just a little bit softer and it loses a little bit of those minute values. And those bushes in the foreground and the bottom right, take a look at the detail in the branches compared to the two. Even with the YouTube compression, you should be able to see a big quality bump in the AS200V as compared to the AZ1. So right now we're looking over the Hollywood sign here. We have the Hollywood Reservoir in the right there, and what we're going to do here is we're going to zoom in and we're going to change between filming in XAVC-S mode and filming in basic MP4 format. So let's say you find yourself in a situation where you actually don't have the right micro SD card to enable XAVC-S mode. We'll take a look at the quality differences there. I'm hoping as we zoom in here, even with the YouTube compression, there'll be a noticeable quality in the HDR-AS200V on the right side of the screen. Just areas like the Hollywood sign, all the scaffolding and stuff like that seems super crisp and sharp. And we can even see on the gate, we can see all the bits of railing and stuff like that in between the gate. And if we go down into the city, we can see the house and the tree branches a little more, while the AZ1 kind of has that sort of softer and muddier feel. Both of them seem to have a very similar color profile, but when we do this clean, sharp line right down the middle of the screen, just notice how you go from the AZ1, look at all the shrubs and the trees and the trails. As we merge over to the right, everything gets a bit sharper, and this is without any modifications to the camera whatsoever. You know, this is just factory settings for the most part. There's just a higher level of quality with the AS200V, and it's going to kind of retain that way. Now what we've done is we switched to MP4 at 30 frames a second. Now the differences might not be noticeable right at the start. They're actually going to be similar in sort of scale. The AZ1 is still going to be a little softer. The AS200V is going to be much sharper and have a little more detail. But when we swap back and forth between MP4 and XAVC-S mode, you're going to see a sort of a slight pop in quality. Now we're going to swap between these two modes and relatively fast, so I would focus on the Hollywood Reservoir on the right side of your screen, and just focus on that because the jump is pretty sudden and the quality loss is kind of subtle, especially with the added YouTube compression. It might not be as noticeable, so we'll sort of zoom in here a little bit. Again, we're in XAVC-S mode, and we're going to switch over to MP4 right now. It's a very subtle difference in filming in Pro mode and it's a very subtle difference in filming in XAVC-S mode and filming in MP4 format, but there is a slight quality loss, and it does get a little bit softer and muddier and a little more artifacty, if you will, kind of if you're exporting with a lower quality codec. So we'll start blowing up some of these cameras one by one so we can just take a look at the colors and stuff like that. This scene's great. We got a great sense of depth and sort of focal distance. We have a lot of colors. The dirt in this area in the Hollywood Hills is actually kind of this rich yellowy red. It's really beautiful. Mix it in with this Camelback backpack here. And actually take a look at the Camelback backpack. Look at the words Camelback. They're much crisper and clearer on the AS200V. If we look at the downtown LA there, again, we have the buildings all just nice and sharp. Nothing's really getting blown out on either of these cameras. We have this sort of wheat right in the front of the grass here, and everything's holding up fairly really sharp. Now with both of these Sony cameras, the focal distance is pretty much, you kind of have everything sharp 4 to 5 feet out away from the camera. Anything closer than that, it starts to get soft and muddy right away. Mainly soft, not so much muddy, but your focal distance is pretty much 5 feet out. So if you kind of keep that in mind when you're filming, you know, you can composite your shots a little bit better. Take a look at this branch that's sort of free floating right in the front here. There's a ton of detail again on the AS200V. It looks great, but the AZ1's not too far off. Now if you're looking at these from a price difference perspective, the AZ1 retails right now, it's June 2015, for around $200. You can get the HDR-AS200V for around $250, so you're looking at about a $50 price difference between whichever camera you go with. Some of the feature differences that we're not going to really go over too much here since we're mainly focusing on the video. The AZ1 has GPS capabilities, but you need to get the right LCD remote. The HDR-AS200V doesn't require a remote, so if GPS is important to you but you don't want to spend the extra money for the wrist remote, that's kind of an added cost reduction. So if you wanted to get the wrist remote for the AZ1, it actually might make it more expensive than the AS200V. But the AZ1 is super small. It's about 63 grams and it's one of the lightest action cameras out there. So for its size, it's pumping a lot of quality doing a really good job. Now here we're taking a look at lens distortion. Just take a look, you know, the AZ1 and the AS200V have an extreme amount of lens distortion. Basically, the further away you get from the center of the lens with either of these cameras, the lens distortion is pretty extreme. And when we're doing sort of panning shots like left and right, any type of movement you can imagine doing with a traditional tripod, you're going to notice as the picture gets to the edge of the screen, it warps pretty heavily. Now you won't notice this a lot of times if you're just filming normally, but it is something to be aware of, that doing these pans and tilts like this, especially if you plan on using this for aerial photography, could be a real issue. So one of the big selling points with Sony's line of action cameras is its built-in stabilization. Basically, it's going to use its gyros and its accelerometers and whatever built-in software it uses to sort of stabilize the footage for us. Now, when we enable steady shot, again, we lose that field of view, but that sort of extra added field of view that's off-screen is actually what's being distorted to kind of help us keep our subject in the center and to keep it from vibrating a lot. Now, stabilization isn't really perfect. It's going to basically remove 60 to 70% of our of our vibration. So here you can see we have stabilization turned on, and then we're going to do the same exact sort of pan move with stabilization turned off. And you're going to notice you can see all of my hand motions and stuff like that sort of slightly being translated into it. Now the steady shot when it was on wasn't perfect, but again, we're removing a lot of that jitter, and when we're just sort of hiking up these rocks and stuff like that, it's much smoother and much more steady and much more easier to watch in playback than if we had it turned off. Now watch the bush as we kind of go by it here on the left side of the screen on both of these cameras. That sort of distortion that I was telling you about on how the camera's trying to keep everything center, a lot of times you'll see that distortion show up in warpiness on the left and right side of your screen, kind of where all four corners are of your footage. You just have this potential to have footage being sort of stretched in and stretched out. It doesn't really take away from the footage, you really have to be looking for it to notice it, but it's just something to, again, be aware of. Now, micro vibration is supposed to be the big selling point of the HDR-AS200V line of cameras. Again, both of these cameras look great with this stabilization. It actually kind of looks like I'm flying a drone right through these trees, but I actually have the cameras mounted directly to my bike. Now, both of these cameras are mounted directly above the center of the wheel, which is helping us a lot, because if you watched our previous video with the X1000V, there's actually a lot of vibration when we just sort of off-centered it from the wheel, about 6 inches to the right. A lot of that shakiness just sort of transitioned into the camera. Now, the HDR-AS200V is supposed to handle micro vibrations better, but honestly, the HDR-AZ1 and the AS200V, since they are mounted so close together, I'm not noticing any real huge difference in the HDR-AS200V. I mean, both of them, the stabilization seems great. Maybe when we zoom in here and push it a little harder, we'll see some of an improvement with the AS200V. But for the most part, both of these cameras seem on par with stabilization in all areas. There's not much more I can say. It's sort of smooth and steady. We're kind of pushing through here. The only big benefit really with the AS200V is it just has a better sense of quality. Like, there's a little more clarity, especially with that house right there and stuff like that. But I would have to be really nitpicky for that to really bother me compared to the AZ1 at its price point and size. Now, originally in this shot, we were supposed to be taking a look at how the AZ1 and the AS200V handle steady shot when they're in a locked-off situation. However, I didn't have the AZ1 turned on for a variety of these shots in steady shot mode, so we're kind of going to take a look at a difference between filming in wide field of view and steady shot. Basically going from a medium field of view focus to a wide field of view focus. Take a look at the sky and stuff like that. You're going to see a lot of that artifacting there again, especially in the AZ1. It's taking up a good, I don't know, I want to say like 40% of our sky in this plate right here in the upper left. It might be a little hard if your monitor's not color calibrated correctly or even remotely correctly, but if you're in the right ballpark, you should be able to see it. Again, when we are filming with steady shot on, there is the possibility that we are not getting the highest level of quality footage for a variety of reasons. But again, I feel like both of these cameras hold up pretty well. You can just notice, like, you know, we're not having the entire Vasquez rocks. They're completely overexposed. There's nothing really egregious with the differences of these two shots when we have steady shot turned on and steady shot turned off. And here's another good look at maybe sort of a framing mechanism that you can kind of think of, because without steady shot here, we wouldn't be able to zoom in and have me and Amanda be sort of bigger in the frame. And it's composited really nice on the AS200V, but with the AZ1, we have a lot more field of view. Now in this next shot, we're going to go into our audio test, so I'm going to sort of quiet down real bit, and I'll chime back in just a bit. 1080p, 30 frames a second. This is the start of our low light. Everything's in high quality, vivid color mode, and on the screen left here, we have the AS100, middle, AS200, to the right of that, AZ1, and to the far right, the AS20. So let's get out there. 1080p, 30 frames a second. This is the start of our low light. Everything's in high quality, vivid color mode. And on the screen left here, we have the AS100, middle, AS200, to the right of that, AZ1, and to the far right, the AS20. So let's get out there.
Just because we get around. We won't try to put us to down. Just because we get around.
before we kind of go into slow motion here, we'll just kind of recap a little bit on the audio. I think it's pretty self-explanatory. I feel the AS200V definitely has a nicer range, a nicer tone and stuff like that. The AZ1 isn't as crisp. It has a little bit of a lower quality, but for the most part, they're not too far off, but I definitely prefer the sound of the AS200V personally. But if audio is important to you or isn't important to you, it doesn't really matter, because the Sony action cameras do a really good job with audio compared to most other action cameras out there. They have a built-in stereo mic, really great dynamic range, it sounds fantastic. And what we have here is both cameras filming at 120 frames per second at 720p. They can do 240p at 480p, but that's kind of too low of a resolution for me. We are also having to put it down to an MP4 format, so we're going to have a lower bitrate with both of these, but the same sort of quality issues are there. With the AZ1, it's going to be a little softer, with the AS200V, it's a little sharper. And we also have options for both cameras to either film in slow motion so you don't have to slow down the footage for you later, or film and playback at 120 frames per second with the audio embedded. So we have a few options for both cameras. Now what we've done is we switched to night mode here, so we're at 24 frames a second. Now my original thought process was that if we're filming at 24 frames a second, we're going to get more frame per second, so the image is going to look better. However, when we get to later shots, we're going to prove that that is kind of wrong with these cameras. Take a look at the dome, the blue dome here in the center of the picture. A lot of that sort of white values being crunched a little too hard will start to show up. You'll notice that artifacting, especially when we're sort of zoomed in on these shots and along the edges of that arc light where the blue dome meets the wall. We're going to see a lot of weird crunching and sort of bleeding in that really shouldn't be there. And we're in a full nighttime shot here. There's not a lot of city light illuminating the area, but take a look at the AS200V. You can see a lot more of the rooftops, especially at this one, sort of in the center of the screen here. We can see a little more detail on the roof. There's a little more clarity. The reason why I kept this shot is because in some instances, when we have a lot of black being introduced to the shot during these nighttime shots, the sky will turn unnaturally blue in the AS200V, and you can kind of see that here, especially when we zoom in a little bit. Look at the nighttime sky in the background. A lot of blue is being pumped into that black sky. It's, again, up to you if that's appealing or not, but again, we have a little more clarity in the water detail there. And take a look at the railings here as we're going out into the distance. The AS200V, all the detail on the pavement and stuff like that, looks great. But check it out, when we switch it to 30 frames per second here, you're going to notice a big bump in light, and my sort of thought process on this is the camera sort of compensating for the faster frame rate and bumping up the exposure a little bit. That way our image isn't so dark. So if you're planning to use this as a dash cam or a security cam where you're filming at night, would definitely suggest sticking at 30 frames per second. Another added benefit with it is we're going to have less motion blur, so if we had a lot of movement or we wanted to capture a license plate at night, we're more likely to get that with 30 frames a second. However, we do have a tendency to kind of bloom things out a little bit, so you're going to have to watch out for that as well. One thing that might come as a surprise with the AZ1 is, even though it's the older camera and it's the smaller camera and the cheaper camera, it has the bigger image sensor. It has an 11.9 megapixel image sensor compared to the HDR-AS200V's 8.8 megapixel image sensor. Now, the quality differences in this are quite subtle. I would kind of expect something with sort of a 4 megapixel lead on the other camera to have kind of a more dramatic difference, but definitely the AZ1 will show us a little more detail. We're going to zoom into 200% here. Take a look at the rocks in the center of the screen and sort of the grass. I know some of this might look like a sort of pastel painting. We're zooming in really a lot here to see some of these differences, but there really aren't a ton. You know, this is the size difference you'll have between these two photos, so if you just need something that's just on a sheer scale bigger that still retains a lot of that data, maybe you should go with the AZ1. And it does have a better button placement for still photography. The button placement on the AZ1 is directly on the center top of the unit, so when you press it down, it's more on the center of gravity and it doesn't really shake the camera around. The camera will actually take the photo immediately when that button is pressed. On other action cameras, they kind of give you a half-second delay. That way the camera can stop shaking. And when we kind of zoom in on this photo, you're going to see some of the issues with the AS200V's ability to take photos is we're actually using the back button on the camera. So when we're pressing that back button, we're actually kind of shaking it a little bit, and the image will kind of have like a little micro vibration when it goes to take it, or it might have a noticeably big tilt when you press it because it takes it immediately. Look at the sort of word orange on that sign. Take a look at these light beams. It's losing a lot of that clarity because that camera is slightly shaking. So if you are using the AS200V and you are taking a photo, especially in low light, highly recommend using the app on your phone or having the LCD remote. It'll improve the quality dramatically. Now when we're filming here with the AZ1, we're again back at the Hollywood sign. There's a great range of colors and clarity on both of these. The AZ1 definitely, in my opinion, looks a little better, but we'll kind of do a wipe here. And I could point out some subtle differences. Actually, you know what? The AS200V definitely is a much brighter image, and that might seem more appealing here. Again, we'll start with the AZ1, and then we'll show the AS200V. The red levels aren't that different. They both seem to have the same lens flare type of issues. I don't know. Maybe the AS200V definitely has a nicer color profile when it comes to photos. I like the red. I like the greens when we do that wipe. When I'm looking at them side by side, they don't look much different. But just seeing that sort of difference as we sort of wipe away, it's definitely I don't know. I kind of lean towards the AS200 in color. But the AZ1 definitely has a little more in the quality department, but it's such a subtle change that it's not really something to get caught up on. Anyway, that's going to wrap up our side-by-side between Sony's HDR-AZ1, the $200 63-gram little camera, up against the Sony HDR-AS200V, the successor to one of last year's favorite cameras for me. I think they're both great cameras. The AZ1's a great companion camera. AS200V is a great sort of budget camera. You really can't go wrong buying either of these, but if it is going to be your first Sony camera, would probably lean more towards the AS200V, but kind of see what works for you and make the purchase that way. Anyway, be sure to like and subscribe and share this video if you found it really helpful, because that will help me a whole lot. You can follow me on Instagram, which is kind of where I update a lot of you guys more frequently, and you can also check out the newly launched MarkHawkCam. We're going to be doing a lot of cool things with that. It's still updating during the recording of this video, but it should pretty much be in final form when we're rolling into late June, early July. So anyway, I'm MarkHawk. Thanks. I'll see you guys out there.